So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first lecture in our IBC and Commerce Bank Keynote Speaker Series for 2023 and 2024. I'm George Clark. I'm the Director of the Center for the Study of Western Hemispheric Trade in TAMIU's A.R. Sanchez Junior School of Business. Our center, together with IBC Bank and Commerce Bank, brings speakers to speak about topics in the areas of international trade, economics, finance, demography, and immigration. So before we start and I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to thank our sponsors for supporting the event, IBC Bank and Commerce Bank. With their support, we've been able to bring many thought-provoking speakers to TAMIU and Laredo over the years. So thank you very much. I'd also like to do a little bit of housekeeping. At the end of Dr. Noland's presentation, there'll be a question and answer session. We'll take questions from the audience in attendance here, as well as those joining us virtually. For those in attendance, all you need to do is raise your hands, and one of our students from the Dean's Student Council will bring you a microphone and you can ask the question. It's good if you could wait till the microphone comes so that people online can hear what you're asking. And for those of you online, what you need to do is you need to enter a question through Microsoft Teams into the app, and it will appear on my computer, and I will read it to Dr. Noland when we have the opportunity to do so. For students attending in person and on behalf of one of your classes, you would have had your student ID scanned at the door. In addition, you are provided with a QR code that will take you to an online form where you submit your class information. Finally, you'll scan your ID when departing once the lecture is finished. For students attending online, your class information should have been submitted during the registration process. And keep in mind that for students, you should stay until the end. Okay, so today's speaker is Dr. Marcus Noland. Dr. Noland is Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a non-resident senior fellow at the East-West Center in Hawaii. His research addresses a wide range of topics at the intersection of economics, political science, and international relations. His areas of geographic knowledge and interest include Asia and Africa, where he's lived and worked, and the Middle East. In the past, he's written extensively on the economies of Japan, Korea, and China, and is unique among American economists in having devoted serious scholarly effort to the problems of North Korea and the prospects for Korean unification. His most recent book, published in 2017, is Hard Target: Sanctions, Inducements, and the Case of North Korea, which he co-authored with Stephen Haggard. In addition to these books, he's written many academic articles on international economics, U.S. trade policy, and the economics of the Asia-Pacific region. We're very pleased to have Dr. Noland here to kick off our IBC and Commerce Bank Keynote Speaker Series for 2023 and 2024. He's going to talk about Asia and the global economy, implications for the United States and the world. So let's welcome Dr. Noland to TAMIU and Laredo.
So it is great honor and pleasure to be here this evening. I was speaking with one of my colleagues last week, and I made an offhand comment about coming to Texas. And she said, oh yeah, that's right, you're going to LaGrange. And I said, no, I'm going to Laredo. Laredo is famous for a dying young cowboy. LaGrange is famous for the best little whorehouse in Texas. She said, it's probably a good thing you're going to Laredo. So it is indeed a great pleasure to be here this evening and not 300 miles to the east. So what are we going to do tonight? I'm going to talk about the United States. Well, I'm talking about Asia and its relationship to the United States and the world economy. Now, before I came down here, I was in Houston visiting my 90-year-old mother. And so, and this is something for the students as well. When you give a talk, you should try to explain to people why it's worth their while. Why is it worth your commitment of time to learn about this topic? And I would say in the case we have tonight, there are two reasons for caring. Number one is shown in that graph on the left. It is a graph of per capita income growth in various regions of the world, but from 1960 to the present. And that top line you see is Asia. It's done much better than other regions of the world, such as the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and so on. So there's this basic issue that they've really done well over a sustained period of time, and that should create interest. The other thing is they're big and important. They account for a quarter of world output in international trade. They have over half the official reserves, most of that held by China, Japan, and South Korea. East Asia accounts for a third of U.S. trade, more than a fifth of outbound U.S. investment. About half the U.S. trade deficit is with Asia. About a quarter of it is with China alone. So it's an enormously important region to the United States and to the world. But there are complications on the horizon. That outperformance has been built on historically unique factors, including and good demographics and competent policy that cannot necessarily be extrapolated into the future. The region wants the United States to remain engaged, but domestic politics are limiting the United States' ability to engage with Asia. Global institutions are failing, regional institutions are alternative, but they also have the possibility, or they carry the possibility, of exacerbating this emerging US-China rivalry. And indeed, concerns about the United States and China kind of cast a shadow over the whole region. So what I'm going to do is give you a kind of very quick narrative of US trade policy towards the world and Asia in particular, and then focus on the current situation we're in, which I will argue is actually qualitatively different. With the Biden administration, we've gone off in a direction that is really different than where we've been for the preceding 50 years or so. And then I'll conclude with some speculation about the future, focusing on China. So what about that US role? Well, for most of the post-war period, I should probably say post-World War II period, the United States was supportive of global integration of the Asian economies via an organization or an agreement called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which I assume most of you have never heard of, and its successor organization, the World Trade Organization, or WTO, which I assume that you are much more familiar with. The GATT and then the WTO had big multilateral negotiations. They're called rounds. Don't ask me why, I don't know. But we had the Dillon round, the Kennedy round, the Tokyo round, Uruguay round, Doha round, and so on. The Uruguay round, which established the WTO, was probably the high point back in the early 1990s. The Doha round that was started in the wake of the 9/11 attacks stalled and failed. And the reason is, for most of the history of these agreements, the negotiations frankly came down to a bilateral negotiation at the end between the United States and the European Union. Japanese would sort of stand behind the European Union holding their coat. Australia and Canada would sort of stand behind the United States, holding our coat. And most of the rest of the world really didn't have much role to play. We and the Europeans would reach an agreement, and the rest of the world would acquiesce. That started to change about 20 years ago, and it changed in two ways, both at the interstate level and the intrastate level. In the interstate level, the negotiations became more pluralistic. Countries like India, Brazil, eventually China, demanded a greater say in these negotiations. So it became more complicated because there were effectively more players that mattered in these big multilateral negotiations that are held in Geneva, Switzerland. The other thing that happened, and it happened in the United States, but not just the United States, it happened in other countries as well. As each round of negotiation lowered trade barriers, more of the domestic economy was exposed to international competition, and that became a political issue. And so trade policy became more salient in the politics of the United States and other countries around the world. That constrained the ability of trade negotiators to reach agreements. So you have a more complicated set of actors at the top, and then each of them have a more complicated domestic politics. And as a consequence, reaching agreements became difficult, and as I mentioned, the Doha round failed. What happened, and I guess in trade policy, abhors a vacuum, right? Just like nature. What happened was a turn towards regionalism, where, and I don't need to explain that to people here in Laredo, where dealing with a more limited group of players, like say Canada, Mexico, and the United States, one could more easily reach agreements. And so the United States and other countries started pursuing regional agreements. In the case of the United States and Asia, we had a free trade agreement with Singapore back in 2004, and a more kind of interesting, a more substantial one with Korea in 2012. But regionalism took the form of broader regional agreements, not just bilateral FTAs. So, welcome to trade policy. Welcome to trade policy, where everything used to have a 3-letter abbreviation, but now we're getting more expansive, and as you'll see here, we've got one with 5. So there have been 2 broad regional agreements concluded in Asia in the last 5 years. One is called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. The other is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. These are 2 different agreements, and they have different characters. So in the United States, historically, when countries negotiated trade policy, they negotiated about border barriers, tariffs, and quotas, because we were moving goods across borders. As countries like the United States moved from being industrial economies to post-industrial economies, where the service sector plays a much bigger role, accounting for most of output and employment in the United States, the agenda shifted to what we call behind-the-border issues: services, investment, intellectual property rights protection, competition policy, which we call antitrust policy, labor standards, things of that sort. It was much more complicated agenda than just negotiating over tariffs and quotas. Tariffs lend themselves to fairly simple types of negotiations. Suppose I have a tariff of 10% on iron nails. I can offer a country that produces them a cut in that tariff to 5% if they'll give me a concession on something that I produce and want to export to them, say beef. Cut your tariff from $10 per ton to $5. Or I'll eliminate my tariff on this item if you'll cut your tariff on another. It's pretty simple because these are, mathematical things. You can even have formulas. Everybody cuts their tariffs by 50%, or everybody cuts their tariffs so that 10% is the maximum. It's pretty simple. But when you get to arguing about services, accession, the ability to open up a service business, the ability to invest, treatment of intellectual property, how long you give patent protection, you're now negotiating over a more complex agenda. And it's an agenda that gets more into the domestic politics of each country, especially when you start talking about, say, labor standards or environmental standards. So what happened was a group of countries that were relatively liberal, that is to say, relatively open, and tended to be, but not exclusively, sort of these kind of post-industrial economies. They entered into something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it was a very interesting agreement because one of the participants was Vietnam, a centrally planned, or what had been a centrally planned economy. So back in the day, we have market economy, which you're all familiar with, but the what you would call socialist or communist countries had centrally planned economies, where the government would make decisions, make plans about resource allocation. And they were Marxist-Leninist political systems. They were very repressive. They had no role for labor unions, for example, and so on. Well, Vietnam was a participant in that negotiation. And we got Vietnam to sign on to an agreement that, for example, included free association of labor so people could form unions. This is really quite extraordinary. But what made it really important was China. It set the template for what China would have to agree to enter the agreement. So getting Vietnam in and getting Vietnam to commit to these things was kind of getting the camel's nose under the tent, so to speak. The problem is that President Obama did not have the political courage in his final year in office to get the TPP through the Congress. He left that to his successor, President Clinton. The problem was that President Clinton didn't win the election. Candidate Trump did. And candidate Trump had campaigned on a platform of getting the US out of TPP. And in his first week in office, President Trump pulled the United States out of the final negotiations. Then something interesting happened. Everybody thought that the agreement would just collapse now that the US wasn't there. But that's not what happened. Japan, which had been relatively passive as a leader in these negotiations, stepped up and led the remaining countries to basically complete the agreement. They didn't have everything that we had negotiated for, like really long patent protections for pharmaceuticals, things like that. Some of the provisions the US really wanted got taken out because the US wasn't there anymore. But they completed the agreement and they had to rebrand it. So they went from TPP to CPTPP. And that's the agreement that now exists. The UK has joined. The Koreans and the Chinese are trying to join. And it's a kind of modern trade agreement that gets beyond just the border issues to beyond behind the border issues. The other agreement, RCEP, is a much more traditional trade agreement. It focuses on border barriers like tariffs and quotas. And it's what we might describe as a dirtier agreement. There are a lot of exclusions. If some country really has trouble with, liberalizing their rice market, you just take it out. So you've got this agreement centering on Southeast Asia, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and China, on the one hand, a sort of old-style, somewhat dirty agreement, and then you've got the CPTPP, a more modern agreement. Some countries, as you can see in the graphic, are in both agreements, and the US is out of both agreements. The US is outside looking in. And so now our firms face discrimination when we try to export into those markets or we try to establish activities in those markets. We don't get the same treatment that the members of those other agreements get. So I want to shift to where we are now in terms of what I said is I think there's this kind of turning point with the Biden administration. But to do that, I need to step back. And I need to talk about those two ladies in those pictures. So the one on top is Chrystia Freeland. She's the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Canada. And she came to Washington about almost exactly 1 year ago and gave a speech that's quite interesting. And I will try to summarize it because I think she sort of made the intellectual case to justify what President Biden is trying to do without actually endorsing the specific measures he's undertaking. Her argument is that we were fortunate in that early era of the Cold War that our main geopolitical rival, the Soviet Union, took itself out of the game by self-isolating. It didn't join the world economy. It tried to organize a parallel world economy with its satellite states based on central planning. So you would have a central plan for the Soviet Union and a central plan for Poland and a central plan for Czechoslovakia, and they were supposed to all coordinate their central plans through an organization called the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. What that meant was that the United States was free to pursue a pretty open agenda to try to bring in other countries into the world economy, to open our economy to our allies like Europe and Japan and South Korea, Southeast Asia, Latin America. And we would all get rich together through mutually beneficial exchange. Freeland argues that the current time is different in the following sense. China entered the world economy. And so now we face the prospect, when we trade with China, we are enriching our primary geopolitical rival. The goods we trade with China may actually be used to strengthen the Chinese military. So unlike the old days where in some sense we could have our cake and eat it too, now we've got to make choices between our economic interests on the one hand and our sort of political, military, diplomatic interests on the other. And from that observation, you get the term decoupling. And I taught a course on this last year, and when I get to the decoupling part, I had a picture of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, because at the time I taught the course, they were suing each other about who hit who. Well, the next lady in the lower panel came along, and that is Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission. She's effectively the president of the EU. And van der Leyen said, well, decoupling sounds a little personal. And it's not just China. We learned in the pandemic that over-reliance on certain suppliers could be very hazardous, that we need more reliant supply chain or more resilient supply chains. So rather than calling it decoupling, let's call it de-risking. That's both a little bit more politically acceptable and covers both the sort of political issue of dealing with China, but also the broader issue of over-reliance on certain suppliers in the supply chain. So where we have gone is from trade wars that I will speak about in a moment under President Trump to wait a minute, I jumped a page. Sorry about that. I do have to talk about President Trump. Yeah. So when President Trump came to power, not only did he pull the US out of TPP, but he initiated trade wars. The trade wars with both allies, but particularly with China. And in the case of China, US concerns involved lack of intellectual property protection, forced technology transfer, lack of market access. And to be clear, those concerns were shared by other countries. This was not just American paranoia. The problem is Trump's solution, which was slapping tariffs on a broad range of Chinese products, didn't address the underlying problems. Now, one could argue that the idea here was that the tariffs were not going to address these problems of lack of intellectual property rights protection or forced technology transfer. But what they would do is create some leverage for the United States that it could follow up in subsequent negotiations. In reality, what happened was the United States and China came to an agreement. It involved the Chinese making targeted purchases of US goods, and then the pandemic hit. So when you go and look at what actually happened, you see that the anticipated increases in purchases from the United States simply didn't occur. One of my colleagues, Chad Bown, runs a tracker on the Peterson Institute website, PIIE.com, where he shows the pattern of trade on the goods that had tariffs put on them, the goods that didn't have tariffs put on them, and so on and so forth. When President Biden came to office, many of my colleagues were hoping that he would then simply remove the tariffs that President Trump had imposed. And President Biden has indeed removed some of the tariffs from some of our allies like European Union or South Korea. But tariff protection tends to be sticky. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's take the case of washing machines. if the United States puts a big tariff on Korean washing machines, U.S. producers of washing machines are benefited because the prices of washing machines immediately rise in the United States. And so they can have bigger profit margins, or maybe even if the line of business was unprofitable before, with the tariff protection and the higher prices to consumers, it's now profitable. So there's this basic political economy that once you put in these protections, it's very hard to take them out. I mean, one of the reasons why you don't see like Japanese or European small pickup trucks in the United States goes all the way back to the 1960s, when the United States and the European Union got into a dispute over, of all things, frozen chicken parts. And the European Union wouldn't let our chickens in, so we responded by jacking up the tariffs on pickup trucks, and that's why. And those were put in 1963, so I guess that's 60 years ago. They're still there. So once those kinds of protections go in, producers lobby to keep them. They don't want to see them disappear. So Biden removed the tariffs from some of our allies, but he has largely kept in place the tariffs on China that Trump imposed. In addition, we have other disputes, other sorts of irritations with China, such as disputes over the treatment of Uyghurs, a Turkic Muslim minority that live up in Western China. The United States government has described Chinese government treatment of the Uyghurs and some other associated ethnic groups as genocide, and the US Congress has passed legislation that effectively puts an embargo on products produced in Xinjiang, the province where these people live. So the Chinese didn't like being accused of genocide. They didn't like the trade embargo either. So there are a variety of irritants in US-China trade, including the maintenance of these tariffs from the trade war, as well as the additional issues of things like disputes over Xinjiang. Okay, now, so then we go to this notion that Chrystia Freeland argues that we can no longer have our cake and eat it too, that we have to make choices between economics and sort of politics. And then Ursula von der Leyen comes along and says, let's call it de-risking, not decoupling, and because it's also motivated by issues related to the pandemic and supply chain resilience. So what has evolved is we've gone from trade wars under Trump, which I think are regrettable, but they're pretty easy to understand, to a much more complicated situation under Biden. And it has two components, and I will discuss each of them in turn. The first of these is kind of a multilateral attempt to square the circle in Asia, to come up with an alternative to RCEP or CPTPP, called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. There will not be a quiz at the end over all these abbreviations. The other thing is industrial policy. And the industrial policy, I'm going to boil it down in the interest of time into two sets of policies aimed at sort of 2.5 industries. The first of these are policies aimed at the semiconductor industries, and those include the CHIPS Act and then a set of export controls that were announced a year ago in October 2022. The other one is the other set of policies revolve around the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Those pieces of legislation have elements that are designed to encourage the adoption of electric vehicles rather than internal combustion engine vehicles for climate change reasons. And they have implications for the automobile sector, but they also have implications for the battery sector, because that's basically, the battery is the key component of an electric vehicle. And I will discuss each of them in turn. So first, IPEF, and then industrial policy focused on semiconductors and electric vehicles. All right, IPEF. So Basic problem for the United States and Asia is that we're good at diplomacy and military engagement. We're not very good at economic engagement. And so IPEF is the Biden administration's attempt to address that lacunae. It has 4 pillars and a so-called menu approach. So a country that signs up for IPEF doesn't have to join each of these in pillars. They can skip some. And there have been countries like India that have done that. The 4 pillars are fair and resilient trade, which includes labor, environment, standards, and digital trade. Supply chain resilience, which includes friendshoring, which is to say tilting supply chains away from China and towards these more friendly countries. Infrastructure, clean energy, and decarbonization, which is the green component of IPEF. And then finally, tax and anti-corruption, which frankly has pretty much gone nowhere. There are 14 countries, including the US. They account for 40% of world GDP, and it includes the 4 Quad countries. The Quad is kind of a military initiative by the Biden administration that includes the United States, India, Australia, and Japan. And so all of those 4 countries are part of this effort. The basic problem with IPEF is that there's no market access offer. Access to one's market is the basic coin of the realm in trade negotiations. Remember, I'm offering to cut my tariff if you'll get rid of that quota. It's all about getting access to your market and you getting access to my market. There is no market access in IPEF. The United States is not offering to open its market to get any of these things it wants. Why is that the case? The US Constitution gives the House of Representatives the lead in formulating revenue policy. And at the beginning of the Republic, tariff revenue was the main source of revenue for the federal government. So trade policy under the Constitution, the House of Representatives basically gets the lead. Now, what we discovered about 100 years ago was there were some problems with that. What would happen is we would send people out to negotiate trade agreements with other countries, and they would go through the kind of process that I sketched out. We'll cut our tariff on nails from 10 to 5 if you'll do something we want, or we'll cut our tariffs by 50% on this if you'll give us something else that we want, and so on. And what would happen is we would reach an agreement with a foreign country, and then the representative of the president who had negotiated that agreement would bring it back to the Congress to pass the implementing legislation. I mean, it's not just, you can't just say, well, we'll cut our tariff and shake hands. The US Congress has to pass legislation that actually cuts the tariff or gets rid of that quota, whatever it is we've agreed to. Well, the congressman in the district where they had a big nail factory, he's not that, his constituents are saying, no, we don't want to cut the tariff on nails. We like the tariff on nails. It gives us, higher return on our product. And so please don't vote to cut tariffs on nails. And so the congressman from that district would go to a congressman who, say, was in a district that was exporting beef and say, listen, I'm going to offer an amendment to not have the tariff cut on nails. And if you'll vote for my amendment, I'll vote for an amendment you might want to have to not cut that tariff on beef. And this process of sort of making coalitions and trading votes was called log rolling. Again, don't ask me why, I don't know. The problem is, I think you can see pretty simply, if you're the foreign country and the representative of the president comes to negotiate with you, and you make a deal, and then he takes it back to Washington, and the congressmen just tear it up and just cross out things and write in their own numbers, well, you have no credibility. Nobody will negotiate with you. So the workaround that the Congress came up with was something that used to be called fast track and is now called Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA. It was abbreviations again. And what happens under TPA is the Congress passes a piece of legislation that says we authorize the president or his representative to go out and negotiate over this set of topics. We authorize the president to negotiate NAFTA. We authorize the president to negotiate in the Doha round. Or, we authorize the president to go out and negotiate some new Pacific agreement. And typically for a limited period of time. And we commit ourselves to voting in a simple yes-no manner without amendment on whatever deal the representative brings back within a specified period of time, normally something like 90 days. So no more individual congressmen wanting to change individual tariff lines. It's a package deal. Either you're for it or you're against it. The problem is Trade Promotion Authority expired, and I actually can't remember if it was in the first Obama administration or the second. It expired. Trump never got it. Biden has never had it, and frankly, it doesn't look like he will for the remainder of this term. So the basic kind of pre-commitment mechanism that the Congress has adopted to make the trade representative credible in his negotiations with foreign countries, or in this case, her negotiations with foreign countries, it just doesn't exist. So the Biden administration finds itself needing to have a trade policy towards Asia. But it's got to be a trade policy that doesn't require legislation. It's got to be a trade policy that can be done entirely through executive fiat. And that's how they put together the IPEF. And that's why it's weak tea. It's only stuff they can do without going to the Congress. So that's the multilateral aspect of what they're doing. But what about the unilateral industrial policy aspect? Okay, so there are concerns about over-reliance of the supply chain, especially in key components in things like semiconductors that may have important military or national security uses. And you may not be able to see very well, but if you look at the second line of that graph, and that is extremely advanced semiconductor chips. And you can see there's a gigantic orange bar there. More than 90% of these very advanced chips come from Taiwan. Taiwan is an island off the coast of China. China regards it as a renegade province. Taiwan regards itself as a self-governing entity. China has been making noise about unifying China. That is to say, somehow absorbing Taiwan. And so the United States and other countries have gotten very nervous. They're getting all these very valuable semiconductors from a single source that may come under attack. So there's a need to diversify the supply chain. The way that the United States has done it is through sort of two policy thrusts. The first is the CHIPS Act. And that includes a bunch of subsidies for production and research and development here in the United States. It makes companies eligible as long as they basically promise not to do business with countries of concern, which is basically China and Russia. And it does other things to support these firms, conditional on basically staying out of China. The second part of the policy were export controls announced, and these were things the president can do administratively last October. And they basically put the squeeze on exporting high-end chips or equipment that could be used to make chips to China. Now, for the really high-end stuff, there are two firms that matter. One's Japanese, the other one's Dutch. And the United States put pressure on the Japanese and Dutch to shut down those exports, and those countries went along. So, so far, we seem to be able to implement this policy, although the industrial structure of this sector has these choke points, like these capital goods used to make these high-end chips that have relatively small choke points. It's not clear at all that this strategy could be replicated in other industries that have a very different structure, like biotech, for example. And then there's also the question that I pose on the slide, which is the US government up to the task? I mean, look, a policy of having tariffs and quotas and then cutting the tariffs and quotas is a policy that even I could implement, right? But a policy of trying to run an industrial policy for advanced chips is something that's really pretty complicated. It's something that's going to require ongoing adjustment. And I think it is asking a lot of the Department of Commerce, at least in its current form. The other big area is electric vehicles and batteries. And as they say in the slide, the devil's in the details. And let me say this, if you can follow what I'm about to say for the next 2 or 3 minutes, that's great. If you can't follow it, that's okay too, because that's part of the message. We are now getting into a very complicated area where what we are doing is we're going from a system that's really relatively simple and relatively transparent to a system that is relatively complex and relatively non-transparent, and thus creates a lot of opportunity for political mischief. So the basic issue is we have concerns about global warming. We want people to switch from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles. So we wrote this gigantic piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's like 1,000 pages long. And one of the things it does is it encourages people to buy electric cars by offering them a $7,500 subsidy to do so. The problem is the way the legislation was written was it excluded imports. And our Korean and European allies went crazy, especially the Koreans, because Hyundai is in the process of building a big electric vehicle supply assembly plant outside of Savannah, Georgia. But it's not due to come online until 2025. So everybody kind of looked around and kind of said, what can we do? We want to encourage consumer adoption. We want to encourage domestic production. We don't really want to screw over our allies. How do we handle this? Well, some anonymous civil servant at the Department of the Treasury noticed something in this gigantic bill. There was a section of the bill that was it appeared to be aimed at passenger vehicles that had this provision that said imports didn't count. But, kind of 50 pages later in the bill, there was this section that seemed to be aimed at trucks. Trucks are normally leased. And so the provisions of the truck section said that you could get, the subsidies for leased vehicles. And somebody got the brilliant idea of making leased vehicles eligible for the $7,500 consumer subsidy. And as you can see from that chart, after that provision goes in, there's no diminution in European sales, and the Korean sales take off. And so we have a situation in which, that's the vehicle. Then we've got the issue of the battery. Batteries involve these various types of critical minerals. Much of the supply of critical minerals comes from China. So writing China out of the supply chain for electric vehicle batteries is non-trivial. The legislation says that in terms of determining the eligibility of the vehicle for the subsidy, minerals or batteries that come from free trade agreement partners are okay. It's not just domestic production, but it's stuff that comes from our free trade agreement partners. So that's okay for Canada and Chile, which have some of these critical minerals. But a lot of other countries have critical minerals like Indonesia and the Philippines and Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we don't have a free trade agreement with them. And so what has happened is the administration is interpreting free trade agreement or trade agreement in a rather elastic way. If we have a kind of trade agreement with you, well, we'll consider that good enough. And so we have this strange situation in Washington now where Korean firms are lobbying, because they're the ones making this stuff, they're lobbying the US government to do a trade deal with Indonesia, to do a trade deal with the Philippines, to do a trade deal with Africa, so that the minerals mined in those places that go into Korean-made batteries will be considered okay under the IRA provisions. And so what we've done is go from a relatively simple system, it's relatively straightforward, to a system that is going to be more complicated to implement. It will create enormous costs and uncertainties for the firms. It's going to be great for lawyers in Washington. And it will also create lots of opportunities for sort of unusual behavior, like the Korean firms lobbying to get trade agreements with the Philippines. Okay, let me stop there, and let me then move on to the final section, which is speculation about the future. And I thought that I was actually going too fast, but now I see that I'm starting to get towards the end. So there you go. All right, so I'm going to end this talk with a discussion of demography. Demography is not destiny, but it's pretty close. Asia has had really good run on demography for the last 70 years or so. It benefited from low dependency ratios. That's the ratio of people who are working in the economy to people who are not, which is to say children and elderly people. And it may be that the elderly dependency ratio, how many old people you have to the working age population, that's really economically salient. What we see now, and you can see in that graph, is that for much of Asia, the working age population is either already falling or will very soon be falling. The United States is the one country in that graph that seems to stand out because our demographics are really different, and our working age population will basically remain pretty constant. So under this situation, it really puts a premium on using female labor more effectively, and these countries don't have the greatest track record on that. In the case of China, UN projections indicate that the Chinese population really ought to start shrinking. By the best case, over the century, it falls by 20%. In the worst case, it falls by nearly 2/3 to less than 500 million people. And again, the United States is really sort of distinct because its population is projected to keep on growing. I'm not even going to try to go back to the previous slide. So those dependency ratios are really important economically. And typically, countries' growth slow when the dependency ratios get very high. Now, there's reasons to believe that the Chinese experience may be different. They're going through this demographic transition and fall in population and a big rise in the dependency ratio when they're still at a relatively low per capita income. Japan peaked out at about 75% of US per capita income. China is much lower, 20 to 30%. So the question is does that mean that the Chinese economy is sort of going to fade away? Or if the fact that they're at a low level of income, they still have a lot of people in the agricultural sector, and they have a lot of engineering talent, does that mean they can keep on growing in a way that, say, the Japanese economy hasn't grown in the last 30 years? And so the question is, how do these two sort of conflicting forces interact? And that's going to be affected by structural factors. So China has its own industrial policies. My reading of the academic literature is, the effects are mixed. But there are causes for concern. In the short run, they have issues related to financial stability, basically because of overinvestment in real estate. As one of my colleagues put it, they build a lot of houses where people don't want to live, and they don't build very many houses where people want to live. But beyond that short-term issue of financial system, what you can see in this graph is a shift in recent years under Xi Jinping towards the state sector. The state sector is absorbing a greater share of resources, and the state sector has lower productivity than the private sector. My colleague Adam Posen has argued they're also subject to what he has called economic long COVID. Basically, the rule in China was, no politics, no problem. If you didn't get involved in politics, you just kept your head down, then you were allowed to make money. But what the very tough zero COVID response of the Chinese government did was to unnerve people, to realize that even if they kept their heads down and didn't get involved in politics, their assets were subject to basically to seizure, either directly or simply by making it impossible to do business. And so as a consequence, even when zero COVID was removed, the response of the Chinese economy in the last year or so to that removal has been tepid. It's not been what people expected. The third thing is increased role of the Chinese Communist Party in enterprise management, including private enterprises. It tends not to promote productivity. So and then finally, we have all this U.S. industrial policy, which is aimed at the Chinese military sector, but will inevitably have a negative impact on Chinese economic growth overall. So the question is China going to be able to return to the sort of growth trajectory that it had in the past, or is it going to have a kind of permanent slowdown? And that has big implications for its role in the world. So what I did was I just did a simple, this is illustrative. This is not any kind of forecast. I basically said, well, what happens if China returns to basically 5% growth and it gradually slows down? Versus what if China's growth really remains sort of in the doldrums? And you can see cumulatively over time that has a huge impact in China's growth relative to the United States. If that pessimistic scenario unfolds, then China is going to peak out, kind of like Japan and Korea have, and they're going to be the relative size of those economies, or at least the relative income levels of those economies, is going to fall relative to the United States. However, if China can get its mojo back and get its growth back up, then China is going to become very, very large. And obviously, those two scenarios have immense differences for world economy, for world politics, and everything. Okay, so where does that leave us? Asia has had a good 70 years or so. Some of that is based on factors that may not be reproduced in the future. The U.S. Asia wants the United States to remain engaged, but American domestic politics make that very difficult. Global institutions are failing. Regionalism is one solution, but it's a solution that could exacerbate the U.S.-China rivalry. And the U.S.-China rivalry just creates enormous uncertainties for the region as a whole. So what I'd like to leave you with is a story. Back in 1999, I participated in what amounted to a war game about the upcoming Seattle ministerial of the WTO. So we were hosting a WTO ministerial, and the US government had a position going in, and they wanted to play out how it would work. So they took a bunch of us over to this place in Northern Virginia, and they kept us there for several nights, and we played this game. And I was the sort of king of ASEAN. Rather than have individual players playing Philippines and Indonesia and Malaysia and so on, they just had one guy playing ASEAN, and that was me. Everybody just ignored me. And I think some of the bigger countries like the United States and Japan, they may have had multiple people, like a president or a prime minister and a trade minister and so on and so forth. The head of the United States, the president of the United States, was a retired American trade negotiator named Mike Smith. Mike Smith was this curmudgeonly, hard-boiled guy from New York City. But he was like this really patriotic American type. He really wanted what was best for America, and he was a really tough negotiator. Well, at the end of this simulation, the ministerial failed. And the final afternoon, the USTR and her deputy and counsel came in to be debriefed about what had happened in this game, and they didn't like that message. And I remember Mike Smith saying, "You guys sent me in here with a bunch of demands, but no ability to make concessions. I had no cards to play to induce the other countries to do what we wanted them to do. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, if a guy who's as patriotic and hard-boiled as Mike Smith is saying this negotiating tactic just isn't going to work, then we're in real trouble. So in the words of Pogo, we have met the enemy and he is us. Now, that's a tough way to end this talk, but there's an optimistic interpretation. If we are the enemy, then that means we can fix it. We don't have to go to Geneva. We don't have to go to Mexico City or Ottawa or London or any place else. We can fix these things here at home without the involvement of foreigners. And so rebuilding in the United States a political consensus for open trade policies is going to be a long-term project. It's not going to happen in this Congress. It's not going to happen under the Biden administration. But it is ultimately, we are our own saviors. It is ultimately on us to fix these things. We don't need to, we're not reliant on foreigners to accomplish that. I apologize for going over time. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for that talk. It was very interesting. So we're now ready to start to start the Q&A session. So we can take questions from here, and we can also take questions from the audience online through the Q&A session. So if someone from the Dean's Council can bring up, that would be great.
Hello. Yes. For my studies in my bachelor's and MBA, we talked about quid pro quo. So in essence, would you say that as we go more international, the quid pro quo concept is more adequate in politics negotiations?
Sure, that's the basis of international negotiations. The problem we find ourselves in, we have nothing to offer.
Exactly. So the further we go to international talks, we have to have something to back us up to offer them, right?
Yeah,
internally here, well, we could hold back a little. Actually, that's my question. Like,
well, you're not going to give me anything for free.
Exactly.
You're only going to give me something if I give you something back. And we've gotten ourselves into a situation where we can't give back to get what we want.
Exactly.
And again, that's on us.
Okay.
That's something we need to fix.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the audience?
Over here to the left.
We have one over here. We have one over here. So.
We'll let him go first. You can go.
Howdy, thank you for coming on down. Niall Ferguson called the relationship we have with China right now a succession of the mutually assured destruction doctrine, except with an E in front of that. So it's EMAD, economic mutually assured destruction. So if China goes after Taiwan, we're going to have, the fact that our economies would decouple would essentially preclude any opportunity for that happening. But what is the goal in all this here? What is our goal with China? I mean, we talk about decoupling, we talk about normalization of economic relationship. What's the goal? What do we want out of this? Have you seen any real direction from USTR on that?
No. I think the best way to characterize U.S. policy is to say that we are kind of fumbling along, trying to find a new balance between our economic and security interests. And that is kind of a messy process that's sort of being played out in public. And we probably went too far one direction, over the last year or so. The recent trips to China of Secretaries Yellen and Raimondo seem to be a little bit more constructive. So we're kind of off the very bottom in terms of the relationship, but we're still in a pretty bad place. And I don't want to blame this all on the United States. I mean, China doesn't make it easy. And so this is going to be a feature of this system for quite a while. of the US and China trying to come to some way of dealing with each other. And in terms of Taiwan, if there were actually a physical attack on Taiwan, coupling or decoupling would be the least of our worries.
Okay. I want to make two comments. First one, although the emphasis is in this decoupling, the risking, similars, is on chips or you mentioned EVs, and sometimes the enactment of export controls. At the end, the big game is kind of competition of who rules the world. That's we argue about national security, supply chains, but it's really who is going to rule the world in the future. That's one comment. The second one related to your solution, okay. True, we can think, for instance, that export controls might slow down, for instance, development of IT in China, the main competitors. But at the end, we might argue that the solution is really, for instance, research and development and education here. China graduates, as you mentioned, 8 to 10 times per year, more engineers than the US. But obviously, we require many other elements. So, yes, there is some, and also the political arrangement that you suggested that are not possible today, but are necessary. But at the end, the game is a global game, and that by itself requires others, So, yes, we are the enemy, and the solution might be at home, but not necessarily so, because it's a global game and it involves others.
So clearly, there are things we can do here to strengthen our own competitiveness. I don't need to tell people at TAMIU that. I mean, we have a public school system in the United States that really is not at the standard that I think most of us would like to see. So you just start there. We can squeeze a lot more efficiency, I think, out of our healthcare system, which we spend a lot of money on, free up resources for other things and so on. I think, that it goes without saying that there is an extensive menu of domestic reforms that we should undertake for our own good, right? Regardless of what China or anybody else does. Your first question about who rules the world, I worked for the Clinton administration, and there was a book that came out around that time, written by Francis Fukuyama. It was called The End of History, and it was sort of like we had won the Cold War, and so the big ideological conflict between the East and the West had ended, and it was just going to be kind of clear sailing. And the United States got used to not really having to think about these issues because we were so strong relative to the rest of the world. At the time I was working in the Clinton administration, we were dealing with the issue of China's succession to the WTO. And we supported that process. The thinking in the administration, and not just the administration, it was a widespread notion in American society at that time, was that by bringing China in and committing China to a set of reforms and processes associated with joining the WTO, we would unleash accelerated economic growth in China that would result in kind of a rising middle class, greater demands for pluralism, if not democracy, and so on. And so at the end of the process, you would have a China that was less repressive internally and less bellicose and belligerent externally. It appears that bet has failed. And so then the question is, well, we've been betting one way for the last 30 years. I mean, this is basically Chrystia Freeland's point. We made a bet 30 years ago. It turns out we bet wrong. What do we do now? And nobody has good answers. She had a good diagnosis, and I praise the fact that she was relatively, in her speech, she was relatively modest about not having the solutions. I mean, she kind of sketched out some stuff, but we're now having to deal with a strategic environment that we haven't had to deal with for 30 years, with a rising challenger who embodies a set of values, especially under Xi Jinping, that are really different than ours. And the question is, how do you come to terms with that? And the Biden administration, the Trump administration tried to do it in its way. The Biden administration is now trying to do it in its way. And one of the things I really want to leave you with from this talk is that the way that the Biden administration is doing it is a really different political economy internally here in the United States than we've been used to running. And it is an internal economy that is going to put greater demands on governance. It is more complex. It is going to be harder to implement. And it's going to create more opportunities for political mischief, for rent-seeking behavior, for special interests to capture the policy, and so on. And I am sympathetic with their notion that we have to do something. I am less persuaded that the particular policies that they are now pursuing is the best way of going about it. But I certainly wouldn't criticize the fact that they have recognized there is a big problem here and there has to be a response.
For people online, I want to remind you that the chat is closed off, so you can't enter things into the chat windows, but you can enter things into the Q&A section, which should be right next. It's on my window. It's right next to the chat, but that would be the way to ask questions if they're online. Are there any more questions from our audience in person? We have a question here.
Hello. So basically my question is just sort of to correlate the seminar with my IPE course. My question is just bringing it back to your mention of how you said Trump's U.S. removal from the TPP was it his way of like taking an approach, like a protectionist approach towards like the increasing competition the U.S. faced with the lowering of trade barriers?
So during my talk, I tried, and perhaps I wasn't successful, but I tried to explain abbreviations, at least the first time I used them. So what is IP?
International Political Economy.
IPE. Okay, great. Well, I think I used the soccer analogy or metaphor when I was discussing that. I think there have been two great own goals in my lifetime, my adult lifetime. One was the invasion of Iraq, and the other was the U.S. pulling out of TPP. It was just stupid. I'm not, I mean, I will, look, not everything President Trump did was wrong. The Operation Warp Speed that developed the vaccines was actually pretty good, and that required a fairly nuanced kind of industrial policy. But pulling out of TPP was foolish. It was a chance for us to establish the template in a critical part of the world economy for how we were going to have our relations with those countries. And then that template, if it was adopted in Asia, would likely become the global template, right? Through the WTO or some other mechanism. For us to just pull out of that and now be on the outside looking in is foolish. And China is applying to join CPTPP. I think in the end they will probably get in. There will be some, I don't know what that is. There will be some watering down of the rules. They'll put pressure on some of these smaller countries in Southeast Asia who, they sort of dominate to go along with that. Weirdly enough, the country that the United States wants to kind of defend our interests in CPTPP is Mexico. because Mexico was one of the few members of that agreement where China is not their dominant trade partner. And the hollowing out of Mexican industry associated with Chinese import surge means that China is not all that popular in Mexico. But I mean, it's kind of a pathetic position for a great power to be in. And we face the prospect is if we ever decided to try to apply to get into CPTPP, we would now be the supplicant. We're the ones that would have to negotiate with the incumbent members, which may well include China. So we went from a position of being able to put our stamp on Asia and by extension the world economy to taking ourselves out of the game for to me, no apparent reason.
You said that we've taken ourselves out of the game in Asia, right? But if we somehow get our cards aligned at home, what are some foreign policies that might be able to push us back in or like reform the world economy to be less towards China's new policy, but towards like what we should have done before we pulled out?
Well, there's a whole agenda of things that were already embodied in TPP. So things like right to establishment. If you have a service industry, then you want rules that basically say, as a member of this organization, I can go to your country and establish my business without you keeping me out. And then once I establish it, I operate under the same rules that your domestic firms operate under. We have issues with regard to investment. We have issues with regard to intellectual property rights protection, although I'm not a big fan of some of the U.S. particulars of U.S. demands. We have because of advances in biotech, there's going to be whole new fields opening up. Drugs in the future are going to be much more made to order. They're going to be much more individualized. And so there's a whole issue of biologics and how you regulate those. There's this, obviously, artificial intelligence, things relating to software, things relating to cross-border electronic commerce. There's just lots and lots of new issues that are arising. And one would think the United States would want to put its imprint on how those rules for the world economy are developed. The problem we have is that we have lots of desires. We have what we want on biologics, or we have what we want on data protection, or eventually we'll have some policy that we want on artificial intelligence, but we're not going to have a seat at the table because we're outside of these things. So I think that we need to both reform ourselves internally to make ourselves internally a more competitive economy. I think we also need, and this is a long-term political project, to reassemble a political coalition to support a constructive engagement in international economic policy. We don't have that now. We have both of the main political parties now take very skeptical positions with that. We haven't had a president with trade promotion authority in years. We're the problem to ourselves. We do more to ourselves than the foreigners do.
Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, I do have one question for you. One thing you haven't talked about at all, which I know you're an expert on, is North Korea. And what I'm wondering is, how would decoupling from China affect our negotiations and discussions and leverage over North Korea?
So, Vice President Mondale once told me, anybody who describes themselves as an expert on North Korea is a liar or a fool. And I try not to think of myself as either, so I will decline your characterization of me as being an expert on North Korea. I'm not sure there is any such animal. It's kind of like that thing that eats, that we saw at the museum today, the legendary animal with the glowing eyes and smells like sulfur, and it eats all the animals. Yeah, there you go. North Korea has been a big beneficiary of the emergent rift between Russia and the West, including the US, and between China and the US. North Korea is really kind of a pathetic place. And it's got, really deep problems. And it's been very isolated, in part due to its own choices. But the Ukraine war and the rift between the US and China has brought China and Russia back into support for North Korea. So, for example, it used to be if the North Koreans launched intercontinental ballistic missiles in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, it wasn't very difficult for us to get a resolution expanding or tightening or whatever sanctions. We can't do that anymore because China and Russia block it. And the rubber's going to hit the road. The real test is going to come if the North Koreans do a seventh nuclear test. If they do a seventh nuclear test, and the Russians and or the Chinese block action in the UN Security Council, we're going to be back to a situation like we were in the 1990s or the early 2000s with the so-called Proliferation Security Initiative, coalitions of the willing, operating outside of the UN system because we can't get anything done within the UN, and that will really be bad for them. So as things get worse between us and the Chinese become even less willing to be helpful in North Korea. Conversely, if things were looking up between the United States and China and we were coming up with some sort of modus operandi to deal with each other, there might be some beneficial spillover into, Chinese behaving more responsibly when it comes to North Korea. You guys are a tough audience. Usually the Mondale thing gets a laugh. I mean, you say you're an expert in North Korea, you're a liar or a fool.
Okay, so we have opportunity for one more question if there's any. Otherwise, I will call it a day. So, firstly, I want to thank Dr. Noland for an excellent talk and for taking our questions. Before everyone leaves, I'd like to thank everyone who makes this event possible. In particular, I'd like to thank IBC and Commerce Bank once again for their generous support of this lecture series. I'd also like to thank some of the behind-the-scenes people. I'd like to thank Jessica Carvosis, who's taken a large part in organizing this event in the absence of the Associate Director of the Center for Western Hemisphere Trades, Amy Palacios. So I'd like to thank them for it. I want to thank all the staff in the School of Business who have stayed late to help us with managing the event. And also I'd like to thank the members of the Dean's Student Advisory Council who have helped out with the event. Finally, I'd of course like to thank OIT for helping us with broadcasting this event and getting another 120 people online to watch this event. And I'd like to thank Event Services for this. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for coming. It's always more engaging when you've got a big audience who are engaged in asking interesting questions. So thank you.
And I would like to thank you for your hospitality. And indeed, I am glad I am in Laredo tonight and not LaGrange.
And finally, we'd like to give you an award from university. This used to hang outside of the entrance to the university. It's not this one. This is a smaller version of it. But this is the Western Hemisphere globe. So this is for you. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you very much for this wonderful gift. And I would like to thank whoever put the billboard with my face on it up. My mother and my daughter are really impressed.